Hi everyone, thanks for checking out my brand new YouTube channel and welcome to my first video about my first watch build. My name is Mark, I'm nuts about watches, and lately I've been interested in learning more about the inner workings and construction of automatic watches, and I thought a good way to do that would be to build my own. So here it is, my first complete project. I ordered parts for this watch from all over the world. The case and the handset came from England, the strap and the dial, which I had custom engraved, came from here in the US, and behind the dial there's a Chinese clone of a 2824 automatic movement. As you'll see shortly, it didn't take me very long to assemble this watch, but it took a couple of months of research for me to figure out what I wanted to build, how I was going to build it, and what tools and parts I was going to need. So I thought I would share what I learned in hopes that it'll be helpful for somebody else who's interested in completing a similar project. I'm going to talk about tools and assembly, but first let's talk about the components that make up the watch itself. So here are all the parts for the watch laid out and ready for assembly. On the left side, we've got the case components. So here's the case itself. The movement ring that's going to hold the movement secure inside the case. Here's the exhibition case back and the crown. On the right side, we've got the leather strap I'm going to use, this butterfly style clasp for the strap, and some spring bars. And then here in the middle, we have the movement, the handset, and the dial. Now, if you're going to do a project like this, the place to start is with the case movement pairing, and I should really include the movement ring in that. These three things need to be compatible with each other. If you find a case you like, check the listing. It's probably going to tell you what movements will fit inside that case, or it might give you a couple of options for different movements, and depending on which one you select or indicate in the purchase, the supplier should send you the movement ring that's going to make that movement fit in that case. Now, you could also start with a movement if there's a particular one you want to work with, like this 2824-2 clone, and you can find a compatible case by simply including the name of the movement in the search for the case. I bought this particular case off of Etsy. It's a 42mm case. It's got a fixed polished bezel. The rest of the case is brushed. It's got a domed sapphire crystal, exposed crowns, no crown guards. It's real thin. So it's a field style or aviator style case, and it's exactly what I wanted for this project. I paid about $90 for it, which is on the expensive side for these internet cases, but it came with a movement ring, a case back, and a crown all in one listing, so I knew everything was going to fit together really well. And my favorite thing about this case is that the movement ring is for the ETA 2824-2 automatic movement. The 2824 is probably the most ubiquitous movement in the watch industry, at least if we're talking mechanical movements. And with good reason. It's a high-beat, hacking, hand-winding automatic movement. It's time-tested, it's reliable. There are tons of parts and components out there for it. If something does happen to it, it's easy to get serviced. And one of the best things about it is it's been around long enough that ETA doesn't own exclusive manufacturing rights for it anymore. And there are several companies that make high-quality clones of the movement. One of the better-known companies, other than ETA, is Sellita. Their version of this movement is called the SW200. And like ETA, they're a Swiss company, comparable quality. Both those companies make fantastic movements, but they're very expensive. So I decided to look for a Chinese clone. Specifically, I wanted the ST2300, which is by a company called Seagull. It's also supposed to be pretty high-quality movements. And that's what I thought I was purchasing when I bought this movement off of eBay. But you don't always know what you're getting when you buy something off eBay, and I don't know if you'll be able to see this on camera, but there are ETA markings right there by the balance wheel on the back of this movement. Now, Seagull would not put ETA markings on their movement, so this isn't a Seagull, and it's definitely not an authentic ETA. If it is, I got the deal of the century. So it's probably what the watch forums call the Shanghai clone. It's a counterfeit 2824, which means it's not very high quality. It's probably not assembled very well. But you know what? It works, it ticks, it keeps good time, and I won't lose any sleep if I break it because it was inexpensive. So I'm going to go ahead and use it for this project, and maybe at a future date I'll upgrade to an authentic Swiss movement. Now, once you've got your case and your movement sorted out, you can go ahead and collect all the other components for your watch. So my particular case here has 22 millimeters between the lugs. So I've got this 22 millimeter leather strap I'm going to use for it. I've had it for a while on another watch. It's a really high quality strap by a company called Crown and Buckle. I'll link them in the description. And I've had it on a conventional buckle. I decided to swap it out for this butterfly style clasp, which I bought from a company called Straps Co. I really like these. I think they look nice and they work really well. And they don't wear the strap down as much here as a regular buckle, which I think helps preserve the straps a little bit. Here I've got some 22 millimeter spring bars for the end of the strap. And this is an 18 millimeter spring bar for attaching the strap to the butterfly clasp. I got this handset from the same supplier that I purchased the case from, so I knew it was going to fit the 2824 movement and the case and look nice. And the last thing you're going to need is a dial. So you can buy a manufactured dial. There's two things you need to consider. One is the dial needs to fit the movement. So most dials have feet, and most movements have holes in them to accept those feet, so they need to match. And then the dial has to fit inside your case. The inside of my case here is 34 millimeters. So this is a 34 millimeter dial. Now I wanted a custom dial for this watch, so I had this one custom engraved, and I purchased dial feet and attached them myself. So the next thing we'll talk about is how I did that. I decided that laser engraving was going to be the best way for me to have a custom dial made. So the first step was to sketch out my dial design. I came up with two, and I'm just going to pick the one that I like the best when I get them back from the laser engraver. I used this graphic design program. It's called Inkscape. It's free online, and there are tons of tutorials for it. But you can use any graphic design software as long as it lets you use a .svg or a vector graphic file format. And that's important because you're going to need to set really precise locations and dimensions for your cutout and engrave areas. You can find the exact location of things like the date cutout here and the dial feet in the dial manufacturer's specifications, and those are going to be in the technical document for your movement, which you can find online. For all of the cut and engrave areas in your dial, you're going to set exact coordinates and dimensions up here. And precision is really important because if your dial feet, for instance, are off by even a couple hundredths of a millimeter, this dial is not going to fit the movement. Two color format's going to work well. For mine, red is a cut line and black is an engrave area. And when you upload this to your laser engraver, they're going to ask you what those colors mean. So this is actually the second batch of dials I ordered. The first batch didn't have these little circles here and here for the dial feet. My plan was to not use dial feet. I was just going to stick the dial directly to the movement using dial dots, which are just little pieces of adhesive. But then I got the movement in the mail and figured out that wasn't going to work for a couple reasons. First, there just wasn't a great spot for me to put the dial dots on the 2824. But the more important reason it wasn't going to work was because of the date complication. So the 2824 has a date ring that rotates under the dial to show you the date through the date window here. And if the dial's touching that date ring, it's going to foul it and it's not going to work. The solution is that the movement's going to come with a little metal spacer ring that goes in between the dial and the movement. And that spacer ring is really just held in place by the dial itself. So it's really important that the dial is really securely fastened to the movement. Now my first solution was to order dial feet and try to glue them to the back of the dial. I found these dial feet online that looked like little nails with heads where you could put adhesive. But then I ran into a couple more problems. First, I couldn't get them in a precise enough location to make the dial fit the movement. But more importantly, they were making the dial a little bit too thick. So I ordered these dials on 0.4 millimeter thick birch plywood, which was the thinnest non-flexible material that I could find with the company that I was using. When I added the dial feet, it made them about 0.5 millimeters thick, which was just a little bit too thick for me to set the hands. So I'm going to try something a little odd. I'm going to attach the dial feet from the top of the dial. So this little red circle here is a hole for the post of the dial foot to go through the front of the dial and stick out the back. And the black area here is an engraved area that's going to be recessed enough that the head of the dial foot is going to sit flush with the top of the dial. So that's going to solve both problems. The dial feet are going to be in just the right location, and they won't add any thickness to the dial. But you'll be able to see them when you look at the face of the watch. That's okay. I think it'll look kind of cool. So I'm going to send these off to Pinocchio, and we'll see how they turn out. Next, let's talk about tools. Like everything else in watches, you can go really cheap with tools or really expensive and everything in between. There are a bunch of these watch toolkits on Amazon and eBay for like $20 that have some version of most of these tools, but they seem like they're pretty poor quality and they weren't really going to meet my needs for this project, so I decided to shop around and build my own beginner watch hobbyist toolkit. Most important tools are here in the middle. Let's start with the screwdrivers. These are Watchmaker screwdrivers, and you could spend a lot of money on these. A couple of Bergeon screwdrivers would cost more than what I paid for all of these tools put together. But I got a pretty inexpensive set to start. They were 10 or 15 bucks on Amazon, and they're going to work great. The next thing you're going to need is a nice pair of tweezers. I'd recommend brass tweezers. There are a few things in the watch, including the hands, that you could scratch pretty easily with stainless steel tweezers. But brass is soft, you're much less likely to damage anything with these. If you're willing to spend a few extra bucks, it is nice to have a stainless steel pair of, these are anti-magnetic number 3 tweezers. But if you're trying to do this inexpensively and you're only going to buy one pair, I would definitely stick with the brass. You're going to need a tool for removing the hands from the watch. You could use a Presto tool. That's what comes with most of those kits I talked about. But I've read that they're kind of finicky. It's pretty easy to damage the dial or the hands with them, and they break. So I went with these pry-style hand removal tools from Esslinger. They're going to last forever, and they're really easy to use. Now, you're going to have to remove hands at least once, because the movement's going to come in the mail with a set of temporary hands on it to hold the date wheel in place, and also so you can just function check the movement. You're probably going to find yourself removing your hands a few times too, because you're not going to set them straight the first time. It takes some practice just to get the hands set just right. Speaking of setting the hands, you're going to need some hand setting tools. I also got these from Esslinger, and all they are little rods with a plastic tip with a hole in the end that allows you to set the hands to the movement without damaging the hands or the movement. You're going to want a spring bar tool. This is for attaching the strap to the watch case. That's one I had in a drawer. It came with another watch I own. You're going to want somewhere secure to put the watch movement when you're working on it, when you're attaching the dial and the hands. And you don't want to set it directly on the table because that could damage the movement. So I recommend getting one of these. It's a watch movement holder. This one is adjustable. It's two-sided. It'll hold a wide range of different size movements. It's got plastic ends here so it won't damage the movement. I think I got that from Esslinger as well. The whole time that you are building your watch, you're going to be battling dust. And this stuff's going to help you keep the watch clean. It's also great for cleaning the crystal when you assemble the watch at the end. It's called Rodico. It's basically silly putty. You can even use this for picking up small parts. For instance, if you're having trouble grabbing a screw with the tweezers, grab a little bit of Rodico and you'll be able to pick it up no problem. Speaking of keeping things clean, this is just a dust blower for keeping your work surface and your watch parts clean. And you're going to want to inspect your watch as you're putting it together. So something like this is great for that. This is a 10X loop that I actually got from my local Harbor Freight. I also got this from my local Harbor Freight. This is a case back removal tool. It comes with a set of these little pegs to make it compatible with different types of case backs. It's adjustable, and your case back's probably going to come from your supplier really tight on the back, so you're going to need this to remove it and then to set your case back at the end of your watch assembly. One of the last things you're going to do when you're putting your watch together is you're going to cut the stem to length. It's going to come longer than you need, and then you cut it to length for your watch case. So a pair of wire cutters is great for that. And then after you cut it, you need to grind the end smooth, or it's going to strip the threads in your crown. Something like this will work great for that. This is just a knife sharpener. You could also use these. These are microfiles I had in my garage. Now the stem's going to be too small for you to hold with your fingers when you're working on it. You could use something like this, these needle nose pliers, but I found it was pretty hard to hold the stem with these securely without damaging it. So I purchased a pin vise. This is definitely the best way to hold the stem while you're measuring, cutting, and grinding the end smooth. And a little bit of thread locker will help you secure the crown to the stem. All these tools are sitting on this green Watchmaker's work mat. This is definitely not required, but really nice to have. The green color is supposed to help with eye strain as you're trying to look at these little tiny pieces. It's also high contrast against the screws and other tiny components in the watch. Everything in watches is smaller than you think it's going to be, and when you drop little screws, it's much easier to find them if they're sitting on something like this. It's also soft to the touch, so hopefully those little screws will be less likely to roll away. So I've also got a few things off camera here that you might want to consider getting. You're not going to want to spend all day trying to hold this up to your face, so I'd recommend something like this. This is just eye magnification. It came with this set of lenses of different levels of magnification, and they clip into this sort of goofy looking sunglasses apparatus. You're not going to look cool when you wear this thing, but it's going to help you work on the watch. It was inexpensive, and it works great. You're going to want a couple of these polishing cloths or cleaning cloths, the kind that come with sunglasses, for cleaning your crystal in your case. Some plastic bags are great to have for keeping small parts from rolling away, and also to help you pull hands without scratching the dial. And then here I've got some toothpicks. You could buy some pegwood. That's what the professionals use. But I'm using toothpicks. Those are just to help you hold things down that you don't want to scratch. A couple of these Tupperware containers are great to have. You can put small things in them, small pieces of the watch, so they don't roll away. And if it has a lid, that's great, so if somebody bumps into your workspace, your stuff doesn't go flying away. You can see I actually have some parts to the watch movement inside this one right now. You're not going to want to touch the watch movement with your bare hands because the oils in your hands can corrode the movement over time. You're also not going to want to touch the case crystal with your fingers after you've cleaned it. So I'd recommend wearing gloves. You could use finger cots, but I don't have finger cots. I had a whole box of these latex work gloves in my garage. So this is what I'm using. And here's the last thing I'll show you. This is a casing cushion. It's just a little padded cushion. It's a place for you to set your movement when you're trying to case it. Definitely not required, but it's kind of a nice place to put your movement anytime you don't have it attached to the movement holder. So that's about everything that I'm going to use for this project. Let's get to assembly. So here are the watch dials from Pinocchio, and they turned out fantastic. The precision of the cuts is really good. The engraving is really sharp and consistent. I'm really happy with them. I'm going to set them aside for now, and we're going to do some prep work on the movement. The first thing I'm doing to the movement is removing the rotor from the back. You might hear this referred to as the oscillating weight. It's the part that turns around inside the case and winds the mainspring. It's a lot easier to attach the movement to the movement holder if you take this off. And it's pretty simple. It's one little screw. Whenever you're holding the movement in your fingers like this or attaching it to a movement holder, be really conscious of where the balance wheel is and try not to touch it. It's really fragile, and if you damaged it, the watch isn't going to run correctly. So now I'm removing the temporary hands, the shipping hands from the movement. And anytime you're removing hands, whether or not there's a dial on the movement, I think it's a good idea to throw a plastic bag over it like this so you don't scratch or damage anything. Before I did this, I aligned the hour and minute hands, and now I'm just getting the pry tools under the hour hand and popping them both off at the same time. So like I said before, these hands are really just for shipping, and I'm going to just discard them. So here are some more parts we're going to need. That's the date wheel spacer ring. And this is a friction washer or friction spring. It's just a tiny curved brass washer that puts a little downward pressure on the hour wheel to hold it in place underneath of the dial. So I just realized that I forgot to extend the dial feet levers. They're just these little metal levers that when they're in, they impinge the dial feet. They sort of pinch the dial feet in the dial feet holes. And that's how the dial's held in place. So you need to extend them to attach a dial. So here I am fitting that date wheel spacer ring. And there are a couple of little sort of cutouts in it that you need to align with the holes that are for the dial feet posts. So with everything in watches, you just go slow, take your time, don't force anything. And I'm just getting it lined up here And when I feel like I have it lined up, I'll put a little bit of pressure on it and it just kind of pops into place. Now I'm just removing the paper backing on those laser engraved dials, so we can pick one out and start fitting it to the movement. Here are those dial feet I spoke about. You can see there's different sizes here, and that size corresponds to the diameter of the post. They're all the same height, and the disc on top is the same size in all of them. So you just need to find the one with the right post diameter to fit your movement. And here I'm just test fitting them to the dial. And now I'm going to test fit the dial to the movement. And everything lines up just right. So off camera, I took these outside and I glued the dial posts in place with some JB Weld. And that stuff smells pretty strong, so I just did it outside in the fresh air. And now I can fit the dial to the movement. So I'm checking to make sure it's flush and all the way down against the spacer ring. And now I'm pushing those dial feet levers back into place. And they're going to put a little pressure on those dial feet posts and hold the dial securely in place. With that first batch of dials that I ordered and didn't use, I did some experimenting with some different finishes. Since these are essentially wood veneers, I tried some different stains and some different oils and polyurethanes, but I didn't like the way any of them turned out. So I'm just going to leave this dial just as is, and we'll see how it ages over time. So now the dial's secured to the movement, and I've pulled the stem out to the second position, the hacking position, and I'm just advancing it until the date just clicks over to indicate midnight. And now we're ready to set the hands. So setting the hands is probably the most difficult part of the watch assembly, and it just takes some patience and some practice. Unfortunately, they get more difficult as you go. The hour hand is the easiest one, and the second hand is definitely the most difficult. So I'm lining the hour hand up with the midnight position. And once I'm happy with the position, I'll grab my setting tool. I'll grab the correct setting tool, and I'll go ahead and set it. So now it's time for the minute hand. And when you're setting these, don't force them. If it doesn't seem to want to go on, adjust the position a little bit and be pretty gentle. I'm lining the minute hand up here with midnight as well. And when I'm happy with the position, I'll go ahead and set this one. So after you set each hand, it's a good idea to just rotate the hands, check the alignment, make sure they're not touching the dial or each other, and they're going to move freely. In the second hand, you don't have to line up with midnight. This is a hacking watch, so you can stop the second hand anywhere and start it again, so there's no need to line it up with anything in particular. And that's it, the hands are set, so now I'm going to give the watch a good function check, checking the alignment, making sure all the hands are parallel with each other and the dial, and nothing impinges. And I also wound the watch and let the second hand run around a couple times to make sure it was working. Anytime you're not working on the movement, it's a good idea to cover it, just so it doesn't collect dust. Now I'm cleaning the crystal in the case, making sure there's no dust in there, and doing a real detailed cleaning under magnification with some Rodico. So now it's time to case the watch. the first thing we have to do is remove the stem. There's a real small little spot in the movement where you can get your tiniest screwdriver in there and depress a little spring that'll release the stem. Don't force it. If it doesn't feel like it's coming out, just try again and be gentle. And you'll notice that I flipped the movement over and set it dial side down on the movement holder. When I did that, I was really careful to make sure that the dial holder was not touching any of the hands that I just set. Usually you case the movement and dial and then put the movement ring in the case after, but with this movement ring it makes sense to just go ahead and place the movement in the movement ring now. And this is one of the best parts of assembling a watch. When you case the movement and the dial and get your first look at what the watch is going to look like. And now it's time to size the stem. I've put the stem in my pin vise, and I'm removing the temporary crown and attaching my permanent crown that came with my case. You don't want to force these on or put them on too tightly. It's really easy to de-thread them. And now I'm reinstalling it in the movement. And you can see it sticks out a little bit. Like I said, the stem comes longer than it needs to be, and you have to cut it down to size for your case. I forgot to mention one really important tool earlier, and that's a set of calipers. So I've got the stem pushed all the way in, and I'm measuring the excess stem here. Now I'm removing the crown, marking the excess stem, and off camera I'm going to cut it and grind it smooth. I reinstalled the crown and now I'm doing another test fitting. And you can see I didn't cut enough off, and that's a good thing. You don't want to cut too much off, so it's better to err on the side of not cutting enough and just repeat the process of measuring, marking, cutting, grinding, and refitting. And this looks good. The stem and the crown fit great, and the watch winds with the stem pushed all the way in. So now I'm reattaching that rotor. Like I said, it's just one screw. And I just realized that I forgot to glue the crown to the stem. So I'm going to remove it one more time. And here I'm just putting a little bit of thread locker. Blue thread locker is the best, so you can remove the crown later if you need to. And it's going to hold it on there just fine. I'm reattaching the crown, cleaning it up with a little bit of Rodico to make sure none of that thread locker gets into the movement, and reinstalling it. Now I'm cleaning the case back, just like I did with the rest of the case. I'll start with the polishing cloth and then give it a really good detailed clean with some Rodico. Now I'm just going to make sure there's no dust in there and install the case back. And before I did this, I made sure that the case back gasket was in position. And now I'm just tightening it down. And that's it. There's the finished watch. Well, all that's left to do is clean up and attach the strap. Attaching a strap's pretty simple. You just have to compress those spring bars and then kind of slide them in between the lugs. Sort of fiddle around with it and you'll feel it pop into place. It's a good idea to give it a little tug and make sure it's secure so they don't pop off while you're wearing it. So I'm really happy with the way this watch turned out, especially for my first project. I hope some of you found this video helpful. and I hope you're going to give something like this a try. If you're like me and you really love watches, but you don't want to trade in a family vacation for an expensive Swiss timepiece, this is a really fun, affordable, and I think rewarding way to sort of get your watch fix. And when you're done, you're going to have a really cool and unique watch that you can be proud to wear. Well, that just about does it for my first video. But I started this channel because I plan on making more. I'm already collecting parts for my next build, and for that watch I'm going to use Seiko mod parts from a few different suppliers. So I hope you'll stay tuned for that, and thanks for watching. Take care, and hope to see you next time.